Well, I want to walk through this report that we just put out at Juno News because I think it tells us what we all knew, which is that the media lies to us. The media is biased. And so I'll just explain what we did. We worked with the search engine, the AI search engine, ChatGPT, and had them look at every single article that was published by the legacy media throughout the course of the campaign. And we had them assign a score. So they looked at the stories that focused on Mark Carney, and if the story was very favorable to Mark Carney, he got a +2. If it was somewhat favorable, +1. If it was neutral, 0. And then if it was critical, they got -1, and very critical, -2. And then they did the same thing for Pierre Poilievre. So first I'll talk about CTV. CTV came in third place, the third worst offender in our list here. And overall, looking at all the stories in the campaign, Carney had a score of +3, whereas Poilievre had a -9. So you could just tell just from that Poilievre was viewed much more negatively by CTV, Carney much more positively, +3. Second place, second worst offender was CBC. And this may surprise you. I would have assumed that they were the worst, but they're
Me
not. They're the
too.
second worst. So they had Mark Carney +5 and Pierre Poilievre -11. I don't think that would surprise anyone that Poilievre was painted in a negative light for more often than not. In fact, when we looked at the stories, we couldn't find any examples of very positive coverage of Pierre Poilievre. But the worst offender, Hamish, was the Globe and Mail. The Globe and Mail, they're seen as the national newspaper of record in Canada, like to put themselves as being, honest, sincere journalists. But they had Mark Carney at +9 and Pierre Poilievre at -15, which was the biggest delta, the biggest difference, the most negative coverage. So Canadians that are consuming their news from these outlets, I would say these are probably the biggest, the most popular ones, CBC, CTV on television, and then the Globe and Mail is still probably the most read newspaper in Canada. All of them would have given you a very negative impression of Pierre Poilievre, positive of Mark Carney. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I'm not entirely shocked. I would have thought the CBC would be worse as well. But the Globe and Mail, Mark Carney is the Globe and Mail's sort of liberal. He presents himself, of course, as this pragmatic, business-friendly liberal, and not the eco-radical that it's pretty clear from his book that he is. He's a sort of liberal that they would have loved to support, and I think we can see in these figures that have come out that's clearly where their mind's at. The thing that maybe helped the CBC not get the worst place prize was that what I found in the election is if there was a story that was bad about Carney, something had happened, he'd had to fire a candidate or something objectively bad happened, the CBC just wouldn't cover it. So they wouldn't even write a story they wouldn't try to make a bad story look a bit better or put a positive spin on it. They just simply wouldn't mention it at all. So I wonder how much that had an impact on making the CBC not appear quite as bad as the Globe and Mail.
Well, I think that there's also been like a decade of preconditioning for the CBC, or probably longer, right?
Yeah.
But the one thing I noticed throughout the entire Trump era, the first time around his first presidency, was that the CBC lead story would always be Trump related. Like, it didn't matter how big of a scandal Justin Trudeau had gotten himself into, how something horrible that he had done for our country. The lead story on the national news for CBC was always Orange Man bad, Trump terrible. So you're right. In some ways, it's like they don't even need to cover the Canadian election in a certain way. It's just the choice of what stories they covered. And I'm sure that happened during this campaign where they were, lead story was something horrible about Donald Trump, which would make Canadians who were watching feel fearful without even mentioning the Canadian election. And this is something that we have. And so overall, we did something called the Tilt Scoreboard. And so this is a number from 1 to 10. So if you're a 1, you were tilting heavily towards Mark Carney. If you were a 10, you would have been tilting heavily towards Pierre Poilievre. A 5 would be neutral. The Globe and Mail tilt score was a 1. CBC News was somewhere between a 2 or a 3, and CTV was 3. So none of them even close to neutral. They were all markedly, heavily pro-Carney in this campaign.